I really enjoyed it. So I was dreading it and I was apprehensive. However, when you're sat here and the team here is amazing, very supportive. And when you're sat here having conversation with your great friend, it makes it all the easier and all the more fun.
Okay, so we're coming to you with another great conversation. So last week, we saying is actually a saying of the scholars. And the saying is, he who knows himself knows Allah. He who knows himself knows God. So, on that theme of getting to know yourself, we are going to be talking today about how our mind, body, and spirit are interlinked, how they impact our states in any given moment, and how we can take action to influence them.
Absolutely. And many of us think that this idea that the mind, body and soul are interlinked is quite modern. When I say modern, maybe the past 20 years. However, what we're going to discuss and what I'm going to introduce to you today is how it's part of our history. When I say our history, I'm talking about us as Muslims. So, Imam Ghazali, who many of you will be familiar with, he passed in 1207 AD. And Imam Ghazali contributed to this idea that the mind, body and soul are one and cannot be disconnected. And we'll go into the detail in a short while. Imam Ghazali was a spiritual master and a teacher. Alongside Imam Ghazali, not alongside, many years later actually, we're talking at 800 CE, Abu Zayd Ahmad ibn Sahal al-Balkhi wrote about the sustenance for the bodies and souls. He also made famous contributions to geography, literature, mathematics and psychology. His approach was more academic, and he produced what we know today as CBT. So we're going to take a brief look at their contributions. Imam Ghazali actually shared a really clear analogy, and I found this really fascinating. So what he said is, the body is a kingdom, the soul is the king, our senses are the army, our reason is the prime minister, our passion is the revenue collector, and our anger is the police officer. That's not a reflection of police officers today. This is how he described it. This is the analogy Imam Ghazali used. And I'm sure he wasn't referring or saying that police officers are angry. But anyway, it's an analogy. Okay, so what did Imam Ghazali say? He said that both passion and anger have to be kept in subordination to the king. And what's the king? The soul. But they can't be expelled or killed because they have their proper function. They need to come into play at some point. However, if our passion and anger master our reason, when I say reason, we're referring to our mind, then the soul will be in ruin. So as Imam Ghazali is sharing this analogy, what do we see here? We see the interrelated, interdependent relationship between the soul, the body, our senses, and our mind.
What I find really interesting about that analogy is often we think of certain emotions as being negative, or certain things that are part of us as being negative, and we try to suppress them. So what he's saying is that the anger and our passions are not to be suppressed, they just need to be directed.
Absolutely. Because there are times and places when anger and passion are necessary tools.
Yeah, or in places where if you aren't angry, that's a problem.
Absolutely, it's counterproductive. So yeah, that's wonderful what you just said there. Actually, that not to look at emotions and generalize them as positive and negative, but notice that they all have a context and they need to be used within that context. Yeah, go ahead.
And I say this all the time. I bet people who do follow me on social media are sick of hearing this. But I say the same thing about symptoms. Symptoms are not negative things that need to be suppressed. They're actually signs. They're pointers that there's something going wrong and you need to pay a bit of attention.
Actually, you know what? You just remind me of something that I read. It's in a book called The Healing Power. So the meaning of symptoms of illnesses and how to interpret them. It's written by someone called Thorwald Dethlefsen. And what he said in this book is The patient is not the innocent victim of some quirk of nature, but actually brings about his or her own sickness. Symptoms are actually bodily expressions of psychological conflicts, able through their symbolism to reveal the patient's true problems. So what he's saying here is that when you're experiencing a symptom, actually the symptom has come to you as a friend. It's saying to you there's a problem inside, and usually it's an emotional problem, and it needs attention. And because you're not giving it attention, I'm here a physical problem coming to make you aware of it.
I'm going to contradict you on one thing.
You've never done that before.
Yeah, it happens a lot. So just the idea of is usually an emotional problem. I don't want anybody to listen to that and the sentence the patient causes their sickness. It doesn't mean you chose to be ill or that you want to be ill. It just means that we'll talk about this actually a little bit later, that we can do things to help ourselves, and we can do things that don't help ourselves, and often we are doing things or not doing them subconsciously. So this is just about taking back power. The second thing is, yes, often, and we'll discuss this as well today, often it's emotional, and a lot of the time it's not. It's something like nutritional. It's about whether you're being exposed to nature and spending time in nature, how in tune you are to the rhythms of your body, etc. So whole load of causes.
Absolutely. And actually I was just coming to that. If some of you may have read the book The Body Keeps a Score. It's by Bessel van der Kolk, and this is what he says again. He talks about how a sufferer, someone who's suffering with something, a physical illness, that often the first place to turn to is medical intervention. And there are times where medical intervention is necessary, so we're not saying that never to use medical intervention. It is necessary at times. But what's being said here is to look at and to consider alternative approaches that heal the mind, body and soul. So it's a collective experience, it's a teamwork, it's a team effort, right?
Definitely.
So coming back to Imam Ghazali, and so what we know so far is that reason is very important. So our mind is very important in making sure that our passion and our anger, and it's not really just anger, but other emotions that are quite heightened emotions that can sometimes feel quite overwhelming. If they overcome and master our mind, that's when they become a problem for our soul. That's when our soul also suffers. So if we allow, this is what Imam Ghazali says, that if we allow our mind to predominate, then we can actually access our soul. And this actually takes me back to something else that I've read and someone that I follow. His name is Jackal al-Malik. You can find him on Instagram. And he writes about the relationship between the mind, the body and the soul. And I've shared this with you, Dr. Ruqia, before, haven't I? And so when I was reading this, what Imam Ghazali has said, it took me back to what Jackal al-Malik said. And he said that the mind is a portal to the soul. And what can distract the mind and divert the mind is the ego. So maybe here the ego can be kind of what we can describe as the passion and the anger and other emotions that can be quite overwhelming. And then the mind being the reason, and then access to the soul. So as long as the mind can filter out the ego, so tame it when it needs to, recognize what is right and what is not quite appropriate, then we can have access to our soul. And for as long as we have access to our soul, we have access to our healing and connection to God, essentially, which is our ultimate purpose. And for those of you who might be interested in and asking the question, well, how do I tame this ego? How do I understand this ego? There are many ways, having a spiritual teacher, having a mentor, etc. But if you're looking for a book, this is only my third book I'm recommending, but anyway.
In 5 minutes.
What does that say about me? Anyway, if you were looking to read a book just as an introduction on how to manage the ego, and people see the ego as a negative thing, and I don't want us to see the ego as a negative thing, but rather it's just a part of us, and it's what makes us human. What makes it positive and negative is what we allow it to do or not do. So the book, going back to the book, there's a book written by Steve Peters. He's a professor at the University of Sheffield, So no bias there. And I think he's in charge of psychiatry in Sheffield also. And he's written a book called The Chimp Paradox. And that book has hands-on tools and techniques, what you can use to help you manage the ego. Anyway, this is just a side note because I've just been dipping into these books recently. But going back to what we were talking about, Imam Ghazali, we've mentioned how Imam Ghazali has presented the idea of the mind, body and soul being interdependent and the importance of being able to manage them all. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, how he presents it, he says that, he presents a rational and spiritual cognitive therapy. So al-Balkhi, as I said, is known to be one of the key founders of cognitive therapy. So what you know as CBT isn't actually a modern day therapy. It goes as far back as 870 CE.
That's I find that fascinating because when the first time I read his book, when I picked it up, I just couldn't believe it because terms that we were coming across when I was doing my psychiatry training, for example, we talk about endogenous depression and exogenous depression.
Yeah.
It came from his ideas. CBT, the way we know it, is a fairly new therapy. But this is, did you say 13th century?
1800. Sorry, 800, my apologies. 872 CE was around that, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So even earlier.
Okay, amazing. And that's not something we hear about, the contribution of these thinkers from the Muslim world to modern day psychology is not something we ever, or medicine, it's something we ever hear about in medical school or probably in psychology training or whatever it might be.
And that's interesting because, this is a whole different discussion, but it makes you, it brings to question the whole idea that modernism is really sold, isn't it? And it's pushed as is the place to go, it's the way to go, it's the path that we need to take. And that's why a lot of these therapies that are actually traditional therapies, in lots of traditions, by the way, because what we also know is that CBT is also found in Stoic Greek philosophy. And so it's not new by any shape or form. But it's presented as new because modernism is more appealing to us, and that's how it's sold. Because if we started to sell CBT as a traditional therapy, then people are going to start looking at alternative traditional therapies and move away from modernism. But again, that's a conversation for another day, another time. So coming back to who I'll refer to as al-Balkhi, what I said is his approach is more academic. And he says, he describes the soul and the body as intertwined, interweaving, and entangling. Isn't that an interesting word to use, entangling and interweaving? It just goes to show the real deep nature of how when something is entangled, it's so difficult to take apart. It's so difficult to separate. And if you do try to separate something that's entangled and interweaved, you're going to cause damage to the materials in the process. And
where do you think this need to detangle things or split them up comes from? Why are we so focused on splitting ourselves up into parts?
Well, this comes from, you'll be able to actually make a greater contribution to this question, but from what I understand is medicine, as we understand in terms of pharmaceutical medicine, has been pushed so much in the past, like 50, 60 years, or maybe even longer, and it focuses on the body. Medicine focuses simply on the body. And so that I understand and I believe that's where the separation comes from, is because it suits people to separate. And for as long as we are dealing with symptoms, we're not actually dealing with the problem. And for as long as we are dealing with symptoms, we can push out as much medicine as possible. So economically, it's a very appealing approach. That's just one approach. And I'm sure there are many, many reasons. But for a layman, looking at it as an outsider into the area of healing, this is what I perceive why the separation has taken place. It's actually, I believe, to hold back true healing. Because healthy people achieve and move forward and are independent thinkers and have time to think and time to reflect and time to be critical and time to judge. And whereas when we're distracted by our health, it becomes very difficult to stop and to reflect and to find and discover.
Do you think, I don't know, I'm just reflecting on that, the thing that comes to my mind is, I feel like it also goes maybe further back. It goes back to the approach we have now of secularism, where different aspects of our life are relegated to different realms. So, religion doesn't come into the public sphere, for example, or shouldn't, which is why there are so many issues with Muslims, because for us, religion permeates every aspect of our life. So if we're compartmentalizing ourselves into, this is my religious life and this is my home life and that's my work life, in the same way as we're splitting ourselves further into mind, body, soul, but actually they are completely interlinked and entangled, as you said. I think it does help clarify ideas sometimes to speak about them in those terms. And I've noticed, even when we're talking, even though we keep coming back to this point, you can't split the mind, body and soul, sometimes we do it. But I think it's because we are so entrenched in the Western approach to things that it's become so entrenched that sometimes we don't even realize we're saying this.
I was actually reflecting on that when I was doing the research, and this is like, I keep saying mind, body, soul, mind, body, soul.
Yeah.
It's not mentioned as one, but rather it's mentioned as components of one.
Yeah.
So even Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, he mentions them separately, but he says that they're whole and one. He refers to them as, and Imam Ghazali the same, refers to them as whole and one. Because I guess it's just recognizing different components. It's like for our eye is one. However, it has different components to it. And so maybe that is where we differentiate the different parts of it. So yeah, great question there.
Sorry about the details.
No, hopefully, like you listening, love the details just as much as we do. But hopefully it's all going to add more flavor and more detail to the show. So going back to al-Balkhi, what he says when he is talking about sickness, he says when the body is sick, then what he refers to as the nafs, the self, the soul, loses cognition and comprehension, and it fails to enjoy. And when the soul is sick, the body develops physical illnesses, and that physical illness prevents us from enjoyment. And in this, what I understood, and actually al-Balkhi even mentions, is that health is joy and happiness, and illness is distress and anxiety. He does go and further develop illnesses into different components, but as an overarching approach to health, the difference between health and lack of health is being happy and joyful. And we're going to talk about that later, aren't we, is what happy and joyful means. But before we do that, what I found something really interesting, which I think everyone's going to find quite controversial. What I did when I read it, but I've come around to the idea. He said a neurotic person, so a person who has neurological issues, and some of them will be
anxiety, OCD, those kinds of disorders. Yeah.
So the disorders are based, that we believe, on the brain and the mind, etc. He says a neurotic person is a person whose emotions are overreacting, and those overreacting emotions have become a habit now. And so healing lies in being happy.
Interesting.
I find it so fascinating how he simplifies healing and simplifies illness.
And does he talk about how does a person in that situation become happy?
We're going to talk about that, but did you have a contribution to that?
No, I was just asking.
Oh, yes. Because that's a difficult question, isn't it? Because when you're in that state of, neurological or neurotic person, as he describes it, then how does that person in and of themselves get out of that state? Is it something that they can do themselves? Or
that's an interesting point.
Or do they need support?
And we shall be covering that very shortly in the remainder of the show. So I guess in a way,
the second half, hopefully.
Yeah, inshallah.
I've done a lot of talking. I'm just going to say my final point before Dr. Ruqia, you can continue. So al-Balkhi then goes on to say, how does the soul become ill then? It says, it depends on what the soul has been exposed to externally and internally. By externally, he refers to the five senses, what they've been exposed to. And internally, he refers to negative thinking. So this is where the reason becomes important and goes back to, what Imam Ghazali said, is how reason is the prime minister.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because to research for this show, we went through quite a few books. And it's interesting how the modern, books are presenting these ideas. That sounds so familiar. So familiar from some of the other books we read that have been written in the last 10 years,
But again, as you said earlier, they've been presented as new developments.
Yes, exactly. A new approach.
It's just a good marketing hack, isn't it? New approach. I've got something new for you. So it spoke about how the soul can become ill, but how can the body become ill? Internally, it's nutrition. Oh, by the way, speaking of nutrition, can we give a round of applause to Dr. Ruqia on attaining a distinction in her nutritionist course with CNM of London?
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
I did not ask her to do that, just in case you
not at all. I'm so impromptu. I'm just a very proud friend these days. I'm very happy because, I'm not surprised because Dr. Ruqia, those of you who know her, is a total genius, so it doesn't surprise me at all.
I don't know about that. I did have a lot of, I'll call it support from Madhia, basically telling me that she's going to...
Can we say this on air?
I don't think we can. Unless I get down and do my essays before my birthday. I remember her telling me.
Oh gosh, yeah, I remember giving those ultimatums.
Yes.
So it worked. So going back to the body, so internally it's nutrition, and externally it's basically when we're exposing ourselves to extreme hot, extreme cold and calamities. And so he also mentions here, when he's talking about extreme hot and extreme cold, he also mentions the body humours, so the blood, the yellow bile, the black bile, and the phlegm, which is traditional in our Ayurvedic medicine, isn't it?
Yeah, Unani therapy.
Yeah, Unani therapy, yeah. So going back to talking about health, or what Abu Zayd al-Balkhi defines as health, in the end he says it's stamina. He says stamina is the body and soul's ability to respond to threatening issues and painful symptoms. And he says someone who has a higher stamina, stronger stamina, can overcome these issues and come to health much better than someone who has lower stamina. So the question is, how do we attain high stamina? And it goes back to happy and joyful.
That's interesting, because we were talking about this, and we were talking about how do we put it into terms that are, the listener is going to relate to. And we came up with the term vitality in terms of what we're talking about here. So this state of being energetic and being joyful and being happy to us was vitality. And the reason we're using the word vitality is because when we think of that term, to us, we were thinking it's a state of optimal being. So being in a state of optimized in every way, which means
both physical, mental, and spiritual.
It's all encompassing, and that's why we were thinking of that term, because otherwise, people start thinking certain terms are linked to the body, certain terms are linked to the soul, certain terms are linked to spirituality, certain terms are linked to mental health. But we wanted one term which encompasses all of that, because as we said, it's all linked. So, low vitality would be not being in your optimal state. So again, we were thinking about, okay, well, what sorts of things cause that to happen? And, it might be arising from any part of you. It might be arising from any aspect of you. And again, this is where we start thinking about the mind, body, and soul, and how all of these are could be impacted to lead you to feel like you're in a state of low vitality. So for example, someone might feel not optimal or a state of low vitality because they have a thyroid issue that just zaps all their energy. It might be because they have depression. It might be because they have issues in their relationships. It might be because they feel distant from Allah and find it difficult to commit to their prayers. So these are all different reasons and different aspects of you that might impact a state of low vitality. The thing is, though, they influence each other, right? So, for example, someone who has a thyroid issue is much more likely to feel low in mood or to be depressed. In fact, thyroid issues can be a cause of depression or other psychological issues like anxiety. Obviously, your relationship issues can cause you to feel depressed or low in mood. If you are feeling distant from Allah and you're feeling guilty about that, that's obviously going to have an impact on you feeling depressed. So all of these things feed into each other. This is what we meant about them being entangled, and it's often quite difficult to tease apart what's going on. But we'll talk about a framework on how to deal with that.
And after the break's just shortly happening, and after the break, we're going to be talking about what it means to us, what it looks like to us, the illness, when on the ground, when our mind, body and soul are not in vitality, don't have high stamina and are in low mood.
Okay, and what we want to say is that this approach is about empowering people and giving you agency. It is not about saying it's your fault, it's about saying what can you do for yourself.
Stay tuned to Salam Radio after this short ad break.
Do you own a restaurant or takeaway? Cater Fair is an expert supplier of new and used commercial catering equipment. Visit caterfair.co.uk for quality equipment on sale at the lowest prices, or call us on 01733 310 115 or visit us at 11 Royce Road, Fengate, Peterborough.
Somalia is facing the worst drought in decades. Livestock and crops are dying in droves, and without rain, children are next. If we don't act now, 350,000 could die this summer. Muslim Hands is on the ground right now, distributing life-saving food and water. Just £100 would feed a family for a month. Your zakat and sadaqah is urgently needed. Please give today at muslimhands.org.uk.
हाँ जी जनाब आज तुसने किया 12 बजे वे
यरा फैमिली की बाहर खड़ना चाहना या खिलाने पिलाने से सोचना कुथे जाओ
इसी च परेशानी वाली केड़ी गल है इब्राहिमी बफे रेस्टोरेंट पर जाओ उते फ्री पार्क करो उन्होंने मजेदार ते स्वादले पाकिस्तानी इंडियन चाइनीज ते इटालियन आय 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 खाने ना ते जोड़ी कोई नहीं नाले सस्ते ते स्वादले
ए तेरा अक्सर इसका मतलब है बटवा भी नहीं होला होनेगा इब्राहिमी बफे रेस्टोरेंट वैरायटी ऑफ डिलीशियस डिशेस के अलावा जेलाटो आइसक्रीम एंड वॉफल्स भी करते हैं वीकेंड्स पर अपना टेबल बुक करवाइए और वीकडेज तशरीफ ले आइए ओपनिंग आवर्स शाम 5 बजे से रात 10:30 बजे तक इब्राहिमी रेस्टोरेंट 63 Sycamore Avenue Peterborough PE1 4JP टेलीफोन 01733 313131
HS Lawyers make it so simple. Contact Majid Sarwar or Asad Arif today for any matters relating to immigration, family, business or property. Google HS Lawyers to see why we're the highest reviewed firm in Peterborough, with over 500 testimonies on our honesty, speed and excellent communication, making your legal matters simple, easy and stress-free. Contact us today on 01733 703 978. That's 01733 703 978 or email us at peterborough@hs-lawyers.co.uk. HS Lawyers, built on values of integrity and respect, with offices in Peterborough and throughout the West Midlands.
At Cake Inn, all our cakes and slices are freshly baked for that delicious taste. At Cake Inn, we bake 100% vegetarian and halal eggless fresh queen cakes. Delicious flavoured cakes for birthdays and weddings, ceremonies and all other occasions, with free customised messages, even balloons and candles too. Order for delivery or collection from Cake Inn, 489 Lincoln Road, PE1 2PE, and your cake could be ready within 2 hours. Find out more and order online at cakeinn.co.uk or call 01733 496 584.
Peterborough's community radio station, Salam Radio, 106.2 FM.
Sorry, technical issue there. We're just getting used to this. Okay, so as I was saying before we went for the break, what we're not saying here when we talk about all of these ideas that we're putting across are not about saying to people, it's your fault you became ill, your anxiety is your fault, your whatever physical illness you've got is your fault. What we're saying, though, is that you have power and you have agency. And to me, when it comes to being not as living as well as you want to live, I guess it means two things to me. One is that you when you take this approach of I have power and have agency, what it means is that whatever issue it is that you're dealing with, that doesn't become your identity. So quite often we hear people saying things like my anxiety, or I am anxious, or my diabetes, or I am diabetic. And, I'm guilty of, as a doctor, referring to people as diabetic or whatever it might be. But actually what we want to move away from is this idea of that's become your identity. What we're actually saying is it's an issue you're dealing with, and it's something that you can do something about, and it's certainly not something that has to be a part of you forever. That's one thing. The other one is that we've kind of touched on this earlier. We were talking about the idea that these symptoms that are arising, whether they're physical symptoms or whether it's psychological issues, these are signs, right? So when it comes to disease, actually let's change that to dis-ease. And that's a completely different understanding that we have now by changing the word. Now your disease is not something that is just inside you, it's just appeared, there's nothing you can do about it. Instead it becomes, I'm in a state of dis-ease. Why am I in this state of dis-ease, and what am I going to do about it? Obviously, while we're saying this, we're also understanding that people do sometimes go through horrific circumstances, and it does obviously have an impact on their state of being. But what we're saying is that this approach that we're talking about here should allow you to reflect on how you feel and have compassion for yourself in that feeling, while at the same time giving you agency on how you respond to that situation or to that illness or to that symptom. So just wanted to make sure that was clear to everybody. This is not about blame. Yeah. This is about empowering people.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really important. And it's what you said earlier. It brought to mind some people when they come and as a client for therapy says my anxiety, my depression, and one of the first things we advise them is to separate themselves from the anxiety and actually perceive it as a stranger that's visiting them.
Exactly.
And you've hosted them for long enough and it's time to leave.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can say something like, I am feeling anxious in this moment, or I am feeling anxious right now. And automatically what that does to your mind, it says this is temporary, it's in this moment. It doesn't mean it's forever. And it's certainly not who I am.
Yeah, it's not your identity.
So we spoke a little bit about the Imam Ghazali and then Al-Balkhi and their approach to mind, body and soul. How does that impact our relationship with Allah?
Well, it's interesting because Imam Ghazali's book is called The Alchemy of Happiness. And in his book of The Alchemy of Happiness, he's talking about illness of the mind and body. And he says, to know God, we need to know ourselves. And to be able to know ourselves, we need to know what triggers us, what brings us to ease and dis-ease.
Okay.
And once we are in ease, that's our best place to have an optimal connection with Allah. We feel high vitality, high stamina to be able to fulfill more of what we want in terms of worshipping God.
Amazing. And it totally leads into what I wanted to talk about next. What we've discussed so far has been very much the theoretical foundations of this interconnected relationship between the mind, body and soul, in fact recognizing them as one rather than separate entities.
And also to notice that this is historically part of our culture.
Exactly.
And it's not a new phenomena.
But what does it mean for us practically in our lives, in our day-to-day lives? Why is this stuff important and how does it impact you? And that's what I want to look at now. But in order to be able to understand that, I want to start off with an analogy that will help you understand how multiple factors influence your state at any given time, and then what you can do about it. So picture this. Your alarm goes off first thing in the morning. It wakes you up from a deep sleep. and it sends cortisol rushing through your veins because you had set the alarm at the highest possible volume, having chosen the most annoying tone because you tend to miss your alarm. Not speaking from experience at all here. So cortisol rushes through your veins, your heart starts to pump faster because obviously you've just been jolted out of this sleep. You look at the time and you realize you've missed Fajr because you didn't hear your early alarms. So you start to feel guilty and you think, oh my gosh, my whole day is ruined now because I missed the first prayer and I've heard that the barakah is taken out of your day if you miss Fajr. On top of that, you feel exhausted because you had a really busy day yesterday and you went to bed really late. Not only that, you didn't eat your evening meal. You didn't have time to make an evening meal, so you'd had a takeaway. And you're noticing as all these thoughts are going through your head that your palpitations are building up and building up. You get out of bed and you feel lightheaded. And now your chest is starting to feel like it's constricted. Your throat is tightening up and you recognize this as a panic attack. And now you're thinking, oh gosh, this anxiety again, when is it going to leave me? So we're going to break this whole scenario down shortly. But what I want you to really question is this really you having a panic attack? Or is it really your anxiety? Or are there multiple things going on here that we can actually tease apart? And instead of naming them as this one ominous entity called anxiety that you can do nothing about, there are actually lots of little factors that you can do something about. So let's go back to this, your alarm waking you up from a deep sleep. First of all, you'd gone to bed late. So obviously you're very tired, you're in a deep sleep, and so that alarm sends cortisol through your body. So that's one influence to begin with, the state of your body. Physiologically, what's happening in your body, you've got these stress hormones coursing through your veins first thing in the morning. We do need cortisol in the morning to give us the energy to get out of bed, but we don't want too much of it, otherwise it's going to make us feel anxious. Then you start thinking, oh gosh, I missed Fajr. The barakah is going to be taken out of my day. So that's your thoughts there.
And the guilt of missing Fajr.
And the guilt of missing Fajr. And spiritually, yes, missing a prayer does have an impact on us spiritually. So we've already got your physiological state, that's your body. We've got your thoughts. We've got spiritual impact of missing a prayer. And then the guilt around missing a prayer.
And guilt is a heavy feeling.
And that's a heavy feeling to carry. So you've already got all these factors and you've only been awake a few seconds so far. Then you've got the tiredness, and the tiredness is there because you had such a busy day yesterday, so you went to bed really late. So now another factor is your bedtime. That's having an influence. And then the other factor is that you were busy, you didn't have time to cook, so you had a takeaway. And that food would not be nutritious. It's going to raise your blood sugars, and the next morning your blood sugars are probably going to drop too much as a response. So you've got another physiological state having an impact on you. Now, you haven't just got anxiety, you've got a set of factors that we can do something about because we've broken them apart. Making sense so far, Madhia?
Yeah, so this is where we understand that actually it's not all in our head. We often hear this. It's very common now. People say, oh, depression is in their head. And, you know, some therapists I noticed, they say, yes, it is in their head. And so we need to break it down and tease it apart and find out what's happening. And others say, no, it's not in the head at all, and you need medication or you know, some physical intervention. But what's really happening here is a combination of physiological thoughts and beliefs, diet and lifestyle. Yeah. And it's only when we look at the culmination of these factors that led to what felt like a panic attack or anxiety attack that we can start breaking this apart and understanding what's really going on and how we can help ourselves, essentially.
Exactly. And what's nice about this is, you know, when you're looking at a problem as a whole, it can be very difficult it can feel like a mountain that you have to climb, and it just seems so challenging. But when you start to break it down like this, you're like, okay, well, I can influence what time I go to bed. I can influence the food I eat. I can influence, if I'm going to bed earlier, then I'm going to be waking up for Fajr, inshallah. So once you start breaking things down and you start treating them as different components, it becomes so much easier to deal with. And now you've got that agency. It's like when they're bite-sized.
You make them bite-sized.
Exactly.
And it makes them more approachable. Yeah. And the other worry is, and I've just had this thought, is when you are experiencing, let's say, a panic attack or anxiety attack, and then you've researched, and Professor Google has informed you of what anxiety feels like and what depression feels like and what happens in people's lives when they have it. then it actually has a compounding effect on you. Because
Exactly.
it's not just going to be the morning, it's going to start playing out in other aspects of your life.
And it's interesting because what I've noticed, what happens then is we can get into this kind of rut where situations where we would have identified them in a completely different way if you hadn't told yourself you have anxiety, you hadn't been told you have anxiety. Now you all start thinking of all of that as this is my anxiety. So
And
if
it's
you,
debilitating, it's disabling, that's how it's presented, and that's how
Exactly.
it feels for a lot of
otherwise
people.
you might say, I'm under stress at the moment, work is difficult, I have a bad relationship with my boss, this is what I need to do about it.
I didn't sleep enough.
Or I didn't sleep
have
enough.
Yeah, I'm
Exactly.
not eating well.
But, once you've been given the label, it starts becoming, oh, I just have this issue, there's nothing I can do about it. And then next level to that is when people are told that it's genetic.
Yes.
And now, well, I have it because it's my genes. I've had that from patients of diabetes. They will say, yeah, but I just have it because my mum has it.
Yeah.
But your genes are probably about 5% of the equation. 95% of it is these things what we're talking about that you can influence. And again, getting this idea out that there's a lot you can do to influence your environment, but also there's a lot you can do to influence your genes. So there are some conditions where, rare conditions where they're inherited in very predictable ways, and they are what we would call genetic conditions. Now, most of these things that we're talking about, diabetes and heart disease and depression and other mental health disorders, a lot of them are, you might have the genes that put you at increased risk, but there's things you can do to influence those genes, whether they're switched on or whether they're switched off. So even on the genetic level, we have influence, which is not something we hear about very often.
And also, they talking about genes, they also talk about trauma that is, genetic
Yep.
or generational. And you think, well, it's generational, it's genetic, I can't change what's happened in their life, so I can't make this go away. But actually, you can deal with that trauma. And when you deal with that trauma, you're breaking that genetic generational cycle.
Exactly. Isn't that interesting, though? When it comes to this idea of intergenerational trauma, we accept that trauma happened to somebody somewhere in your ancestors and it was passed down. But what we can't accept is that trauma can also be broken, and then that new genetic information can be passed down. It's interesting, isn't it? We have a negativity bias.
Yeah.
And maybe that's there to help us keep us safe in dangerous environments, but actually it can also be detrimental if we're not aware of it
And not managing it.
and not managing it. So, as we're saying here, is that your brain takes information from your body. So that would be your heartbeat, your rate of breathing. It might be your, tiredness levels or energy levels, etc. It takes information from your senses, and it takes information from your thoughts and your beliefs. And these are influenced by obviously things like your spiritual beliefs, but also your past traumas, your upbringing, etc. And then it takes that information, puts it together, and comes up with a conclusion about the experience that you're going through. So this scenario I just mentioned, one person would look at this whole scenario and say, I have anxiety, because that's influenced by their beliefs, by their upbringing, by their traumas, and perhaps what they've been reading. Another person might look at all of this and say, well, I have an issue with high cortisol first thing in the morning, and I probably have blood sugar imbalances, and I'm not eating right, and my circadian rhythm isn't on track, and all of that's making me feel the way I am. So the way we make a judgment about a particular situation, or the way we label it, is very much based on our experiences and our internal states. And obviously that is different from person to person. So
some people, I'm just hearing these thoughts, and I've had these conversations. Some people don't realize the impact that a food has on their body.
Yeah.
And it can be experienced immediately. And I can say this from experience, because if you're going through a long period where you're working out, and let's say you're eating well, you're working out, etc., and then before your workout, or in that day, you've had a meal that is not a healthy meal by obvious measures, that workout is more difficult to do. Just by measuring, and you've had the same sleep, the same rest, etc. The only thing that's different is the meal that you had earlier. That workout is much harder, and so if you look at it, the impact can actually be felt straight away. What nutrition is going into our body, and how much vitality and stamina we have.
there are actually studies that have shown that your nutritional status will have an impact on your perception of stress. So that isn't even the physical symptoms of stress. That's your beliefs about your stress levels, which is fascinating, isn't it? How does food impact our beliefs? There's so much we have to learn.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this, how the biochemical changes affect our nervous system and how our nervous system affects our biochemical changes later on. And, for those of you listening, do, send us a message, drop us a call on, I forgot to do this, 01733 602 133. We love to hear your thoughts, your comments, any questions you have. If there's anything we've said and you're thinking, that doesn't ring true, actually I've got a different opinion, we'd love to hear. We're here for an open discussion. You can also text on 07411 191062. There's also, you can comment on the live stream on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter or Twitch. And please do join us in this conversation, because it is a conversation that we want to have with our community. Going back to what you were saying, Dr. Ruqia.
Not just the two of us. So, as I said, our experiences, environment and internal landscape all impact our beliefs, our conclusions, our judgments of a particular situation, which means it's going to be very different from person to person. And I've already given an example of how. What it also means is it's going to take a little bit of digging for you to find out what's really going on for you.
Can you share some examples of where you've noticed someone coming with anxiety and it's been a physical issue and not a mindset issue?
Okay, at the top of my head, I can think of depression, actually, so I'll go with that one.
Yeah.
So I did some rapid transformational therapy for someone who was having issues of low self-worth, and she and feeling very depressed in the morning. So she's waking up, she's feeling depressed, her day's really unproductive, and on top of that she has this sense of low self-worth, and it's showing up in her in the jobs that she's applying. I think I might have mentioned this last week.
Oh, go ahead
anyway. so we thought, okay, let's deal with this sense of self-worth, because clearly that's what's causing the depression as well. So we dealt with it. That feeling of low self-worth disappeared. She applied for different jobs. She is now managing this amazing medical clinic in London, in Holland Park. So, but she said, but I'm still waking up depressed. And then I said, okay, let's look a bit deeper into what's going on for her in terms of what she's eating, when she's sleeping, her lifestyle, etc. And she has a very busy lifestyle. She barely eats. She goes to bed late most nights, and she wakes up feeling depressed in the morning. And because she's got this constantly running on adrenaline type of lifestyle, what that can do is it can really fatigue our system. And so the body doesn't produce the cortisol. I mentioned this earlier. We need cortisol to give us energy to get up and go in the morning. And if that cortisol isn't at the levels that it should be, you can feel demotivated, you can feel low.
Yeah.
So that was her reason for feeling depressed. So what we did was we recommended some ashwagandha, which is a herb that can help boost those cortisol levels. And she started taking it, and she came back 6 weeks later, and we have this scale where you scale your symptoms from 0 to 6, 6 being as bad as it can be, and hers had gone from 5, it'd gone down to 0.
That's amazing.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, it reminds me of actually a client that I did rapid transformational therapy with, but we did it the other way. Before she had the therapy, I also, after assessing her, identified that she probably has low cortisol and needs ashwagandha, and she took ashwagandha, and she did already feel like a different person. And then after the RTT, the depression again, has gone. And there's a client who last Ramadan was on antidepressants, and even with antidepressants she got through Ramadan with great difficulty. And so we were coming upon Ramadan was approaching, and she had the anticipation of those feelings coming back again. And she'd even been to the GP and she had the prescription, but she didn't go to the pharmacy. She came to me and she said, I'm going to hold on to this, and I'm going to give you a chance, and I'm going to see what happens. And mashallah, she didn't take those antidepressants, and she had an amazing Ramadan, and she just feels like a different person now.
Mashallah. So the point we're making here is, for different people, the same symptom or the same situation can have a different cause. Therefore, to treat them with the same drug for each person doesn't make sense. And particularly when it comes to depression, we know now, there's a very recent study that analyzed all the data that we have on depression, and the conclusion that they came to was that actually this theory that we have for depression, which is the low serotonin theory, which is that people are depressed because they have low serotonin levels. Actually, what they found was there's very little evidence backing that theory up, which is astonishing because our entire treatment of depression is based on that theory.
And it has been for so many years.
For decades.
Like
Yeah.
we have clients, depression clients, that come to us for therapy. They are always on that drug, regardless. And to think that actually there's very little theory they're telling us today, it's shocking.
Now, just as a disclaimer here, we're not telling people to
Come off any
medications, or we're not giving medical advice here. It's up to you to go to your GP and have a discussion. All we're saying is that there's more to look at when it comes to things like treatment of depression than just handing out a drug.
And in terms of more to look at, what can you share with us in terms of what can everyone go away with that may be suffering with, let's say, anxiety, depression, or any physical or mental illness?
Okay, so, we said lots of different factors influence how you feel. The problem is when you're in a moment, so you're in that situation I just described earlier, you're not going to be able to tease apart all these different factors at that time. What you can do, though, is start to learn to look a little bit closer and a little bit, with practice, a little bit deeper on why certain situations arise for you. So that might mean that you notice your experience to begin with. So you notice, don't give it a name like anxiety, but actually notice in my body, what am I feeling? So my chest is tight, or my throat is tight, or whatever it might be.
Maybe a sick feeling in the stomach often.
Exactly. What are your thoughts around that? Then think about what actions did you take prior to this, or what actions did you take during the situation? And then notice your environment. When am I feeling like this? Is it when I'm with a particular person? Is it a particular time of day? Is it when I've had a particular food? What's going on around me when I'm feeling like this? And what state is my body in at that time? When you start looking at all these things, so you actually might even journal and write them down, you start to come up with clues. And you might realize, actually, this is not an emotional state, it's a physical state. Or you may realize it's actually an emotional state in reaction to a particular person in your life or a particular situation. Whatever it might be, now you're beginning to get an idea of the factors that are at play and that you can do something about them. So, we're not advocating instant relief coping mechanisms necessarily, because a lot of them are maladaptive. What we will do is give you some coping mechanisms that you can use for instant relief that are not maladaptive, that are not going to feed that state that we're talking about. So, Madhia, why don't I ask you to mention your favorite one?
All right, okay. And actually, yesterday we were at a talk, which is organised by a New Muslim Circle, and I actually asked a question about grounding, because I'm a firm believer in grounding. I've noticed its effects upon me and also the people that I've worked with. So what do I mean by grounding? Well, we're human beings. We're made up of atoms, a number of electrons and protons. The electrons are negatively charged and the protons are positively charged. There's a balance of them, which create balance within us. But when an atom is unpaired, it becomes a free radical with a positive charge. And this starts to damage our cells. It causes inflammation, cancer, and many other chronic diseases, or diseases, should I say. So this is what's happening to us on a chemical level. What's happening to our body when we are in dis-ease. It's an imbalance within an atom of the electron and protons. And an imbalance in such a way where we have too many positive, so too many protons. So we need to bring it back to balance. We need to bring this dis-ease back to ease. How do we do that? By something called grounding. A grounding can be found, so the Earth's surface has negative charge. So it actually acts like an antioxidant. So this impacts what we call as the vagus nerve, which we will have to talk about
Another time,
yeah. But just to quickly say that the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the autonomic nervous system. It extends from the brain to the colon, and it plays a key role in the heart, lung, digestive function.
It basically innervates almost every organ in your body.
So that's why it's so important to look after. And grounding is one of the ways to look after the vagus nerve. So how can you do grounding? Your skin can be on the ground. It can be grass, moist soil, sand, gravel, concrete. Maybe you want to swim in an ocean, or hug or lean against a tree. So let's talk about walking on grass or standing on grass. You need to do that for about 30 minutes a day. You might be thinking about hygiene. So you can wear natural fiber cotton socks or leather sole shoes or wool. It doesn't interfere. And that's one of the ways that you can actually bring yourself from dis-ease to ease.
Now, we said in each show, you'd have one thing that you'll take away with. This is your takeaway. Go and do some grounding. And if you're in a situation where you need instant relief and you can't ground by stepping on the earth or whatever, another way to do it is actually shake out your body. So just stand up and shake out your arms and legs as much as you can to try and bring your focus from your head into your body.
So you've got two things. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Ruqia. And thank you for listening. Thank you for joining the show. We hope that you found this beneficial. We've given you lots to think about, and I'm sure you've got lots of questions to ask. So please, you're very welcome to drop a message on any of the places where Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. Dr. Ruqia, I want to say thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much for listening. We will be away next week, taking a bit of a break, but we'll be with you the week after.